I'm Amy Zawi with the Jerusalem Connection Report for Friday, December 2nd. It has been quite a month for us here in the States with the election of Donald Trump and the aftermath of watching his presidential appointments over the last couple weeks. There are people who are in shock from happiness and people who are in shock with sadness over his election. But be that as it may, no matter what side of the aisle you come down on, if you support Israel and the Jewish people, you should see hope and a glimmer of happiness. In the frenzy of appointments, Donald Trump has appointed a few women and a few minorities and a few women minorities to a variety of posts, including one South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, who has been a true friend of Israel since she's come on the legislative scene. She was one of the first governors to introduce in her state anti-BDS legislation. That is legislation that meant that no state funds could be used with any organization or agencies that were involved in boycott, divest, or sanction activities against a particular company because of its ethnicity, its national origin, or what have you. Basically for discriminatory practices. Therefore, she did not name Israel specifically in her legislation, but she has mentioned publicly that was part of her intent. Like Mike Pence, the vice president-elect, he shared that same vision, championing similar legislation through the Indiana legislature, and so far, nearly 30 states have passed those measures, and many more are going to vote. At the same time, federal-level legislation of the same vein has been stuck in the Senate because of the Obama administration, even though it got bipartisan support in the House and Senate. So with the upcoming new administration, perhaps the federal level legislation will pass early 2017. This should be exciting to all. But Nikki Haley in particular, a minority female from the state of South Carolina who has been openly supportive of the nation of Israel and the Jewish people during her time on the public scene, is a refreshing addition to our delegation to the United Nations. The United Nations is an organization that repeatedly demonstrates bias and prejudice against the state of Israel and the Jewish people, calling it out with unfair assessments that it is somehow violating human rights. Resolution after resolution and declaration of condemnation have been set to the floor in the UN and passed by a variety of nations that are almost laughable that they should have such a vote, including nations on the human rights councils such as Libya and China, and places where open, documented violations of human rights at the hand of the government are ever present, and yet somehow only Israel gets called out. That said, at least with Nikki Haley at the UN, these activities will be called out and argued, and a voice of reason will be heard. In that other news regarding the UN, while 6 open resolutions currently exist to condemn the state of Israel for a variety of ill-perceived or false accusations of human rights violations, ironically, a humanitarian arm of the UN has awarded its highest recognition and honor to Israeli emergency response medical teams. So while the rest of the UN is condemning Israel for who knows what, one arm of it is recognizing the humanitarian efforts and practices of the volunteer medical teams that go into areas of natural disasters as an exemplary model of efficacy and caring for the human condition. In other news, the UN, let's look at France for a moment. Another irony to consider. The national level of France has a law in the books to outlaw BDS activities. That is, actions that seem to boycott or divest or sanction the state of Israel for ethnic reasons or perceived policy woes. At the same time, the food labeling industry has mandated that all products sold in France note the exact territory from which it originated, whether it's Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, or the Golan Heights. Anyway, there are 200 disputed regions in the world today, and no other nation or disputed claim has been noted in this legislation. Nobody's asking Morocco to label products from the Sahara or China to label products specifically manufactured in Nepal. That said, Israel is called out to label their products in the hopes that consumers would then choose to boycott them because of the so-called disputed territory or occupational oppression that the Israelis, they seem to think, have. That said, the irony there is that the actual people who are hurt by these boycott actions are the people themselves, the workers and the inhabitants of those regions, which include a variety of minorities, not just Arabs, but also the Druze. In the French publication called The Independent, a news article articulating this labeling law used a photograph of a box of apples that had some writing on the side. The writing indicated, it was in another language from French, that the apples were from a Druze company and packed in Golan Heights. Now, with that said, to boycott that particular product would mean that you are boycotting the Druze. The very people, the BDS people, are trying, or say they're trying to help. That is, the minorities in these areas that Israel or Jewish organizations are overseeing. So with that, one also has to recognize that Arabs and Druze and minorities that are employed and living in areas under Israeli leadership and with Israeli companies are also under the employment laws of Israel, which are far more strict and fair and protective of the worker than the laws of other leaderships, including the Palestinian leadership and surrounding nations. Therefore, those who are employed by these Israeli companies have a better chance of safe and clean working conditions, upward mobility, and a road to prosperity. So all these BDS actions in Europe, are actually hurting the inhabitants of Israel who are trying to make a living and take care of their families. Numerous on-the-ground video reports interviewing many Arabs and minorities who choose to remain anonymous for fear of reprisal have openly stated that they would prefer to work for the Israeli companies. They are happy there and that it helps them take care of their family, and they have a safe and clean working environment to make their living. That said, additional boycott, divest, sanction activities go on in the entertainment world, with a few select artists constantly rallying for pop artists and other popular musicians to not perform in Israel. May I say that Jennifer Lopez and the Australian group Air Supply have openly snubbed their nose at such requests and calls and are playing happily in the nation of Israel in the coming months. Bon Jovi did this last year, as well as other artists. So I'm happy to see the music community is learning that the Israeli people are just as much eager and enthusiastic consumers of music and should be supported, and their policies are in fact fair, and these musicians are analyzing the situation and coming out on the side of Israel and will patronize their nation. With that said, a little bit of good news on top of the bad. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Have a great week.